Hello there, welcome to another episode of the True Gamer Top 10, and in this Top 10 I'm going to be talking about the Top 10 worst Nintendo systems of all time. That's right, the Top 10 most terrible systems and handhelds released by Nintendo. Here we go. Number 1, Color TV Game, came out in 1977. The Color TV Game was essentially a crappy dedicated consoles that these were only released in Japan, so they only came out in the Japanese market. Basically what they were a color TV game type of system that, it only featured like 6 types of certain games, and it was like a built-in type of game, so you couldn't include a cartridge in there and kind of change games. It was basically built in. The TV Game 6, which was the first one that came out in the late 70s, it had 6 types of light tennis, which were basically just rip-offs of Pong. It was just a cheap knockoff of the Pong game that was, that classic, legendary game that was basically ripped off by Nintendo. So shows Nintendo's unoriginality right there. Awful color TV game lineup. It had crappy graphics, of course. I don't have to really expound on that. There was only 2 colors available on the screen. It was just a very simplistic bunch of lines that were going back and forth. It also featured a horrible first-generation audio sound, very simplistic bleeps and bloops. It didn't really have an amazing soundtrack or anything like that. It couldn't really have any of those MP3 style compressed music or even a MIDI file. Very awkward and stubby controls. If you've ever actually tried the controller, it's incredibly very bad. It doesn't even have the rumble or a shoulder button like L1, L2, or R1 and R2. The Color TV Game, overall, disappointing. It's a piece of crap back then, and thank goodness that we've advanced so much further in gaming technology. Only about 3 million were sold, including every model of the Color TV Game up to the early 80s, so it wasn't really a big success, especially now, you compare it to the systems today. Alright, number 2 is the Game Boy Light. Came out in 98. Now this was basically the light version of the original Game Boy. It was a little bit smaller, about the same size as a Game Boy Pocket. It featured a gimmicky backlight, basically that severely drained the Game Boy's already short battery lifespan. So if you include AA batteries in there, you have to include 2 AA batteries. It would just completely ruin the batteries within like 5 minutes pretty much. You don't have any lasting longevity with the batteries. The backlight itself doesn't really improve the graphics because, the 8-bit graphics of the Game Boy, they're not great to begin with, and it still looks like a heap of hippopotamus feces. And really only a few thousand were sold in Japan in terms of the actual Game Boy Light system itself, and it barely lasted a few months on the shelf until it was actually replaced ultimately by the Game Boy Color. So even the Light itself and even Nintendo themselves were like, screw this crap, we're gonna put out the GBC instead, enough of this Game Boy Light garbage, let's move on. Coming in at number 3 is the NES. Yes, the Nintendo Entertainment System came out in 1983, and this was basically a crappy 8-bit game console that came out in the early mid-80s, whether it's Japan and the United States, and the United States a little bit later. It was the Famicom originally, but became Nintendo Entertainment System. Really is the worst of the 3rd generation era of gaming. Where can we begin? The system featured quite a lot of design flaws, including a cheap ZIF connector, which it basically wore out the contact pins. And this means that over time, the cartridges were prone to getting dirty and dusty, and the system itself had problems playing the games. And the cartridges were very difficult to play on the NES because of all these issues. And even if you blowed wind into the cartridge, like if you were blowing into the cartridges, that was a remedy that people thought could work, but it made the problem even worse, so it didn't work. Blowing into the cartridges made it even worse. The lockout chip also caused a red blinking light, which turned the system on and off by itself, so that's a major issue right there. They tried to lock out, certain illegal games and unofficial games because people were basically pirating certain titles and creating crappy unofficial titles. But the lockout chip caused even more problems for the NES. And the games themselves, the actual NES titles, they're not anything special. The graphics sucked, the gameplay stunk, and by the early 90s they were largely forgotten about and nobody cares about NES anymore. Coming in at number 4 is the N64. Came out in 96, alright, the N64, or the Nintendo 64, was originally scheduled to release by the mid-1995. But it was delayed for well over a year because Nintendo, they were so pathetic in releasing a new system, and this caused a lot of fans to basically move over and jump ship to the other systems, Sony PlayStation 1, the Sega Saturn, and so they lost a lot of followers, and people haven't looked back since. It really wasn't that powerful of a system anyway compared to the other competition at the time because of its limited texture, and it was still using outdated ROM cartridges instead of game discs. So it didn't use CDs, it used freaking cartridges. It's outdated. These are the problems that Nintendo kept pushing. They basically stunted their own development in the system because by the late 90s the N64 just doesn't have enough memory or capabilities to feature high-quality cutscenes or audio or cinematics. These are idiotic decisions by Nintendo, and a lot of the third-party publishers moved away from the N64, and ultimately to this day, this problem still is a problem for Nintendo. It's still happening now because these third-party publishers were like, well, Nintendo sucks, their systems are terrible, we can't make games for them. The N64 games themselves were basically inferior compared to the PS1 and the Saturn in terms of the memory. It has weaker memory. It lacks the video and FMV capabilities in the cutscenes. It doesn't have videos. It doesn't have proper soundtracks because of limited memory. N64, awful system. Coming in at number 5 was the Game Boy Advance. Came out in 2001. That's right, the GBA, the original one, sucked big time for the 6th generation handheld era. So many problems with this one. It featured a crappy 2D graphics that were basically outdated by the early 2000s. It felt more like a cheap handheld Super Nintendo, basically, or maybe even a Sega Genesis. But even the games themselves were basically just crappier ports of games that we saw like 10 plus years ago on the 16-bit era. A lot of them were just rehashes and ports, and a lot of them were basically redundant 2D games. It didn't have a backlight initially. The original GBA had crappy lighting, and the graphics were horribly unseeable. You couldn't see it, you could barely see it unless you were sitting next to a lamp, an actual other light source that was bright enough where you can see the stupid graphics. The screen itself was just a dark mess. You could barely see it. Terrible handheld. Coming in at number 6 is the Wii. That's right. Came out in 06. Wow. Well, this is the Nintendo Wii. It sold a lot of units, but ultimately the Wii hurt Nintendo's reputation because it sucked so badly as a system. It lacked third-party support and third-party games, making its library very weak and forced Nintendo to rely on its exclusives. So it didn't have the third-party support, continuing with the problems of not having third-party games. Its weaker specs were basically very inferior compared to the PS3 and 360. The games looked cheaper, they looked last gen, especially not having HD. It didn't have HD capabilities. How pathetic is that? It focused way too much on a casual audience. It was way too much casual based instead of hardcore gamers. the Wii games were mostly like crappy party games or crappy music games or motion sensor style like leisure games. They were basically inferior compared to the PS3 exclusives and even the Xbox 360 exclusives. Coming in at number 7 is the Wii U. That's right, the Wii U came out in 2012. Now, finally Nintendo dropped an HD system. Finally, after so many years, but unfortunately, again, it feels like a cheap ripoff of the PS3 and the 360. They try to have the HD thing, they try to have the high resolution. Many of the third-party games that came out on the Wii U are basically just ports of the last-gen games. They're already been released on the PS3 and 360, whether it's the Tekken Tag 2 or Sonic All-Stars Racing Transformed. These are basically rehashes. We've seen it already. You know, the Wii U's not getting Xbox One or PS4 games. You know, it's not getting the games that's available for those systems, the current gen right now, so it's not able to compete with them. It's the inferiority of the Wii U hardware. It's not even a comparison anymore. The third-party publishers like EA, Ubisoft, even Bethesda, they've all expressed some kind of less interest or even zero interest in making games for the Wii U because of its poor sales. It's not selling enough, so many third-party developers and publishers are basically like, screw this, we don't want to make games for the crappy Wii U. It's not selling enough and its specs aren't that high anyway. And there's just way too many remakes and rehashes on the Wii U. The Wii U has had Wind Waker HD. Oh wow. A GameCube game. Mario Kart. Oh wow, what a big deal. Another Mario Kart. Donkey Kong. There you go. Another Donkey Kong game. Wii U just feels all too familiar. It's not selling that hot, and it's just a pathetic entry into the 8th generation. Coming in at number 8, Nintendo DS. That's right, the DS came out in 2004. This was a horrible handheld from the mid-2000s. The DS basically featured crappy graphics, a lack of memory, really. Like, you can't store, you know, videos or music in the DS compared to the PSP. It wasn't an innovative system. It was a crappy portable handheld, really. A cheap gimmick, you know, the stylus and the touchscreen. That's just a gimmick. The only good games that's worth checking out are basically games like Pokemon, which we've seen already in the late 90s and early 2000s. Everything else is very childish, kiddified, library. The hardcore gamers can't really get into it. The mature audiences can't really get into the stupid DS. It's a pathetic, crappy handheld that has barely any games available for it that's worthwhile for hardcore gamers. It's mostly kiddified crap. Oh, and it doesn't have any Game Boy backwards compatibility with the original Game Boy. How sad is that? Coming in at number 9 is the Nintendo 3DS. Yep, the 3DS came out in 2011. Basically another crappy handheld. It was full of problems and mistakes by Nintendo. Once again, it felt very outdated. There were so many constant remodels and re-releases of the 3DS. They just kept making a crappier version of it, and they try to, you know, update it, but it's not really updated. It's just they're changing its design for money-grubbing purposes, basically. It's just a cheap cash-in. They just put it in a different visual design and different ergonomics, but at the same time, it's not offering anything fresh or different. The 3D mode itself, it can be really harmful to young children, and the images themselves can be eye-straining and cause headaches. So, a handheld portable is giving you headaches. That's a big problem right there. Overall, boring games on the 3DS, a crappy library, more focused towards kiddified crap, you know, just childish games, very cartoonish. There's no mature games, really, not enough mature games on the 3DS. It's gonna go the way of the stinking DS, but it's gonna sell even less. It's just not a good handheld in any way, shape, or form. The graphics sucked compared to the PS Vita's amazing visual, high-res graphics. 3DS is a mess. And finally, number 10 is the Super Nintendo, the SNES. Came out in 1990. This was an awful 16-bit era system. Featured no internet access. That's right, it didn't have any internet access. Unbelievable. So you can't even play multiplayer. You can't hook it up online. There's no Nintendo eShop. There's no online store. You can't even use a headset to communicate with the other people around the world. It has no HD. Yeah, Super Nintendo didn't have HD. It's a pretty crappy standard system. So you basically have this crappier resolution. The screen is obviously not widescreen or full screen. It's a crappy standard screen. So you got that cutoff, you know, left and right, that black cutoff. And you can't see the graphics in high resolution. So you got this pathetic, visually derailed graphics. Very cheap and flimsy controllers. The Super Nintendo controller sucked. They only featured a few buttons. It doesn't even have analog or rumble. It doesn't have rumble, yeah. Yeah, I can't even... How pathetic is that? Most of the games on the Super Nintendo are also just, you know, they're just cheap rip-offs. There's really only around like 6 or 7 styles of games on there. There's the fighting games, platformers, RPGs, shoot-em-ups, beat-em-ups, puzzle, and sports games, and that's about it. And they're all 2D. It doesn't have games like COD. You know, it doesn't have Battlefield. It doesn't have GTA. It doesn't even have Pokemon or StarCraft or Warcraft or Minecraft. It doesn't have any of that. It doesn't have God of War. It doesn't have Bayonetta. It doesn't have any of those games. And when you have a system like that that doesn't have anything amazing, obviously it's a pile of crap. I'm gonna vomit right now just thinking about the Super Nintendo's lack of quality games. So that's it. Those are the top 10 worst Nintendo systems. That's right, Nintendo, they've been around for many, many decades, but they've released some pretty crappy consoles and handhelds. And this is the top 10 worst, crappiest of them all. Don't even bother looking up at any of them or even trying to buy them. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of cash. It's a waste of your time to invest in Nintendo. Nintendo, more like Nintenderps. The True Gamer Top 10 is created, performed, and produced by the TheReviewSpace channel. Please check him out on youtube.com/TheReviewSpace. Thank you. Until next time.